Hello and welcome. We've got another week of learning here. We're going to learn a little bit about Purim this week. So, hope you guys all enjoy this upcoming presentation I'm going to give and just a really broad overview of just about everything Purim. So, there's always more to find, of course, and you can always expound on some of the things I'm going to talk about today. But find that this is going to be a lot across the board, and you're going to learn a lot about the holiday and what it's all about. So, of course, Purim is the name of the holiday. Now, that is referring to the Hebrew word lot, as in casting lots. So, Purim is a plural of that casting lot. And it is because it was that Haman had cast lots for the day on which he would wipe out the Jewish people. Now, it was determined then that this would be a rather horrific day in history, and yet, because of the events as told in the story of Esther and the bravery that Esther had, and the heart that God created in her, she was able to go before the king and to save her people. And we now celebrate that same fated day as a day of gladness and feasting and of joy and celebration. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about Purim and some of the retelling of the story of Esther. So, of course, why celebrate? We went through just a little bit here. This story is told in Esther. It's the book of Esther that we find in the Tanakh, and it reiterates specifically in the text a call to celebration. Here in Esther chapter 9, they call the days Purim after the day of Pur. Therefore, all the words of this letter and of that, this letter being the scroll and the story that's being told, which they had seen concerning this matter which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon them, upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them. So as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing and according to their appointed time every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. So this is a big deal, so let's keep it going, shall we? When we should celebrate is something that comes up and is a little bit of a thing of debate, as is everything in the Mishnah, am I right? So Esther chapter 9 also says that this was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that day a day of feasting and gladness, but that the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day, and on the 14th and rested on the 14th and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. So we're going to see that that's a biblically mandated thing that is a tradition that gets held up. So we're going to talk a little bit about that further on. So there is all kinds of debate about when it's appropriate to read and when it's not. Now, they say it can be read on the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th, not before, not after. You know, it's not like you can't read Esther any other time of the year, but if you are specifically reading the Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, that is meant to be done publicly, specifically on one of these days. Mishnah even recounts the difference between whether it's a walled city and has been a walled city since the time of Joshua, son of Nun, or whether it's a village or a large town that has been without a wall since Joshua, the time of the son of Nun. And so with all of that, there is this opportunity then to debate when it should be read, but maybe all the better that you can just read it on the 14th day, specifically even what's just said there in Esther chapter 9. But it is traditional to read the whole scroll. Ladies often are the ones that read the scroll and are able to present that, present that to their community. So there are a few different traditions that show up all throughout, just even with Esther specifically. Particularly, we see in the text that her name changes. She's at one point called Hadassah, and the other point she's called Esther, and we know her by by the name Esther a little bit better. Now, one rabbi says that she was actually Esther, that the Hadassah is because that's what the upright are called. Another rabbi says that no, her name is actually Hadassah, but she is called Esther because she was concealed. Now, it's interesting because the name Esther means star, and the name Hadassah means myrtle tree. So it says she was neither to be tall nor short like a myrtle tree. Who knows? A nice average height young lady, according to tradition. One rabbi says that her complexion was yellow, but that she had grace. I don't know if that's meant to mean that she maybe wasn't very attractive, even though a lot of traditions say that Esther was very beautiful. And she is considered a prophet, and we're actually going to see that a little bit later, what that prophecy may have been. So the interesting thing is there's a lot of Talmud and there's a lot of tradition and things that go around with these stories. So there is a tradition that you can go and read in the Megillat that talks about, and I say that, excuse me, let me back up. Megillah means scroll. Megillat Esther is the scroll of Esther. Megillah is a name of a tractate within Talmud that tells everything Esther within Talmud. So let me just be clear about each of those points. You can go into Megillat in Talmud and you can read about this point where it says that the three angels came to Esther, one raising her head so that the king could see her, one gave her grace, and the other who made the scepter longer. So there was this mandate that anyone who went before the king without being called would be put to death. And so and that's unless the king extends his golden scepter out to her, right? And she puts her hand on the golden scepter, and that's the sign of acceptance of her. And so there is this story that one of the angels actually truly extended that scepter out to Esther. Now, when it comes to modern celebration, there are a couple different things that we do. These five are probably the biggest. When it comes to reading the Megillah, that is absolute number one. Make sure you know the story. Read it to the kids, to the adults, everybody. Read it publicly, and make sure people are there and are listening. That's a mitzvah. Now, there is an option to fast and do some preparatory fasting, both in remembrance, in grief, but in prayer, and just to take that time for some sort of solemnity for the holiday. Feasting, of course, is commanded. That is part of what is also included in Scripture, what we do on the 14th and the 15th of Adar, and what we're trying to remember here, that this is a day wherein we are to remember the bounty and the blessing of God. And that also leads us to be able to give and to enjoy that with others. So there's gift giving that's very specifically done, particularly of food, and we're going to see a little bit more detail in that too. Masquerading, the good old-fashioned idea of getting dressed up and coming as something that you are not in everyday life, right? We're going to talk about that a little bit more too. So, Megillat Esther. Mishnah is the oral history, and it has a lot to say about what Esther is all about in her traditions. So, according to the oral tradition, the reading of the scroll of Esther is very important, that it actually takes precedent over studying the law, the Torah. That if you were to gather together and for whatever reason you only had time to read one scroll publicly on this day at this time, you read Esther and not Torah. Interesting. The other side of this is that the Levites would apparently cease their duties in the temple and would stop and the go hear the reading of Esther. So they would make sure that that there was an opportunity to get everyone to hear this story. Now, if it's read at the right time, according to one rabbi, it can be read just by one person. If it's not read at the right time, and again, there's a different school of quote unquote right time, but if it's not read in that quote right time, then only when 10 men are together is it permissible. So another rabbi, however, says that in both instances, it must be read only when 10 men are together. No matter what time you read it, you have to have at least 10 publicly to hear it. Now, there are times that there have not been 10 men present, and, and sometimes you might even just run around and gather a group of random people and start reading aloud and say, hey, I'm fulfilling a mitzvah in your ears. So do with that what you will. Now, the important part is that each individual should read the Megillah for themselves. Even if you go to a synagogue and you hear the Megillah read, that's awesome, and you may really enjoy it, but still go home and study it and read it for yourself. Get those words in your eyes and in your heart. So the funny thing is, Adar is actually a leap month. If you don't know, the Hebrew calendar has a leap month as opposed to a leap day. And it happens 7 times in a cycle of 19 years. And they have figured out how that sort of ticks over year by year. But what that means is that the month that's added on is called Adar 2. Now, the interesting part about that is Adar 2 is actually considered to be the actual Adar. There's a little bit of a debate going on about that one. You can find out more about it. I encourage you to do so. It doesn't necessarily offer clarity as far as I was concerned, but interesting to know. Adar is also considered the most joyous month of the year. So, some people even will consider a leap day the bonus day of their 4-year cycle, right? Why not consider Adar to be the most joyous bonus month that's given in your year? Now, there really should be no difference between the 2 months. All the Torah portions are meant to be, the same thing. The reading of the Megillah occurs in both months, and technically, since Adar 1 is the additional month, if you are only able to celebrate or to read on one, for whatever reason, pick the second one, pick Adar 2, but you should be reading apparently on both months. Now, tradition says that Adar was the month on which Moses both was born and died. Interesting. Now, I don't think it actually specifies whether it was Adar 1 or Adar 2, but interesting to know for the month itself. Now, why is this Megillah different from all Megillot? Did you see what I did there? So the funny thing is, there is some unique stuff that can be learned with Esther, and that specifically for the reading of this Megillah, you'll notice that there are 5 other Megillot scrolls that are not part of Torah, but that are venerated scrolls read at different periods in the year and are associated with different holy days. Those are Ruth, Song of Songs, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Now, Esther is different from all those others for many different reasons, but some of these in particular that are actually kind of cool. For one, Esther has a totally unique canting tune. Now, that is also true for Song of Songs and for Lamentations, but you'll find that they are unique even from the Torah and the Haftarah canting tunes. So there is a different joyous tune that goes along with Esther, whereas it's a very mournful one that goes with Lamentations. And so that idea is meant to exaggerate and amplify the words of that which is being spoken. The funny thing is, I've pulled a few different examples of this, but the experienced cantors will add in musical puns. So, for example, if there were a point at which the word eights, which is tree, would be mentioned in the script in the scroll, maybe I, as the cantor, could say eights, because what we might hear is go, huh. It's Chaim, right? You would hear, oh, it's Chaim, and you're like, oh, So and when someone is saying arise, you might use the canting tune for calling someone up to Aliyah. When they're when reading the name of Haman's 10 sons, the cantor will do so in one single breath on one monotone. Really interesting. Now, some of those traditions can be individualized. If there were like an in-joke specifically for the congregation, that's something that each cantor gets to throw in. If, for example, our congregation does the sim, 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 shalom, and we do the echo back of the sim. If there were a chance in the scroll to read the, grant peace or grant sim, if we were going to come up with that, maybe we would go sim, 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 and play around with it a little bit. You totally have that option if you were a cantor reading this scroll to your congregation. Super interesting to me. So this also, Esther, you'll see here on the screen, has some really, really gorgeous scrolls. It is the only scroll that it is permissible to decorate. And so you'll see that it will have the full text, but often has these unbelievable drawings of the characters and of the just individual letters in the floral and almost like cathedrals with the columns and everything. I mean, just how cool these details are. And we'll see that there's even more given when it comes to decoration for the letters themselves even have a decoration to them, which is absolutely beautiful. And so they, when something is permissible as far as no, a Torah scroll is very, very particular in what it must look like, and no one would dare color in the margins of a Torah scroll. So it's just interesting that when that becomes permissible, that yes, you may color and draw and amplify this scroll. Many have taken that to heart and done something really beautiful with it. So here you'll see this is the what are called tagin, and that means crown. It sits on top of certain letters in the scroll. Now, any one of these is going to have, you'll see that there are like the three prongs or the one individual sticking off of some letters. In the Esther scroll, what they've done is they add three dots then branching off of each of the three root tugging, that they'll do then maybe three more in the arches from that and three more in the arches from that, and then they'll do these big, since they are called crowns, there's even more given to the expansion of the crown on the page, and some really, really beautiful strokes and illustrations that are added, mounting to the well, bringing in the emphasis even of what's happening, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, excuse me, upper left-hand, left and right. In the upper left-hand corner, Esther is the word that is on the right-hand side of that panel, and it has a crown just above it. And the next picture below, this is the panel that starts the counting of the names of Haman's 10 sons. And you'll see that there is an arching illustration of the tugging that goes over top, connecting, where there's a repetitious va'et, 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 as it says, and then names the sons on the right-hand side of the column. And we'll talk about that a little bit more moving on, too. So, blotting out the name of you-know-who, I've already said it a couple of times, but it is tradition to blot out the name of Haman. The practice has been traced, oh my goodness, between reading and talking, I can't do this, but it has been traced back to the 13th century. And there are a couple different ways to do this. Look, if you have a journaling Bible, maybe you should go in there and literally blot out the name. It would be, quote, kosher to do so. Now, for if you want to follow the tradition of writing his name on the bottom of your shoes and stomping on it when the name is read, you can use a noisemaker, which is called a grogger in many situations. Some people will make their own or have one like this in the picture that spin it around and it makes noise and it drowns out his name as we say it and tell the story. Some of the communities also boo and hiss at his wife's name, Zeresh. In southern Germany, they'll say "Phooey" when Haman goes home with his head covered in 6:12, as Esther 6:12. It's a play on words of the phrase "hafui rosh," covered head. So they phooey, which is actually kind of funny. So now you may know that God's name doesn't actually appear in the text. The Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, which is the four-letter name of God, does not appear as "and God said this" or "God did that." It's not there. So what we find that some people have taken then to the full scroll and have found on what are called equidistant letter sequences. So if you were to count 20 letters and then write it down, and then count 20 more letters, and then write it down, and then count 20 more, and then write it down, that those 3 letters that you wrote down would actually say something. Now, what people have found is that the Tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, Yod, He, Vav, He, appears in those sequences throughout the book. The initial letters with a backward spelling, the initial letters with a forward spelling, final letters with a backward spelling, and final letters with a forward spelling. So it kind of like pushes in toward the middle of the book. There's a lot of speculation as to why it shows up the way that it does, but it does show, and that's kind of interesting. Others, this is a little cute, say that other sequences reveal the word Mashiach, which is Messiah, I am, and even Haman and Satan stink. All right. It is believed to be written in the Spirit. This is something that has been acknowledged, considering the fact that there are several verses that could not have been written without some sort of ethereal and spiritual insight that the speaker could not have possibly known without the Spirit having said that that was the case. And now there is a tradition that Mordecai and Esther themselves wrote the scroll, and so might be very much the opportunity for each of them to have been inspired, and then considering this as canon and moving it in as a holy book in that way, and telling the story in an accurate way as per spiritual influence. Now, there is a fast that takes place. Of course, in the book, Esther tells the women and the Jews of the town to fast as she does before she goes before the king. And so it is traditional that some will commemorate this with a 3-day fast. Now, that means a couple of different things. You could do a daylight fast. You could do a fast just from food and still have water. It doesn't necessarily have to, it's not like Yom Kippur where it's a 25-hour dry fast. That's a little bit different. But if you were to join into some of these, there are spiritual ways to approach that and to join with it if you should choose to do so. You can also do just one day of fasting and don't necessarily have to do the three. And that's just a personal observance that some people choose to join in with, women in particular, considering the not necessarily command, but request of Esther to have her maidens and her people join with her. Now, it's also traditional often to fast because of other holocausts that have occurred against the Jewish people. And as we move through these next few slides, keep that in mind that there is a point with this holiday at which we can be a little bit more solemn and understand what really happened on those days and to put it into some perspective. So in the scroll, there is like a unique prominence given to the names of Haman's 10 sons, and all of them, like I said, are read in one breath. The translations of the names are not great, unfortunately. It's just some people have taken those to mean different things about the character of the men as well. But it's led to some interesting bits of speculation. Now, something to understand as we move forward here is that there is a spirit that has moved through people in time that has encouraged people to commit the same atrocities as Haman. And that spirit is one that and very much encouraged the Nazis and others throughout history. Particularly, some have noted Purim's contribution to what happened in World War II and many of the events that happened then. Purim was a day to specifically murder and oppress Jewish people and to spread very hateful anti-Semitic things, and that even Hitler himself banned the reading of the scroll and the celebration of the day, and was something that even he acknowledged that if they were not to succeed, that the Jews would celebrate a second Purim. Now, Purim Fest were among the last words of a man named Julius Streicher. He was sentenced to death in the Nuremberg trials. He himself gave a message in 1938, before his death in 46, that this actually was the day after Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which many know as a precursor to many of the atrocities that happened in the death camps. And in this speech, he stated, in one night, the Jew butchered 75,000 Persians. As he left Egypt, he killed all the firstborn. Under the protection of foreign bayonets, the Jew would have butchered and murdered us. Never forget what history teaches. The Jews would have instituted a new Purim festival in Germany. Now, he actually had published an article way back in 24 that was called Das Purimfest, and it was about Purim, and while I've not been able to track down the text of it, most cite this as a bit of his own anti-Semitic propaganda in his explanation of the feast and its celebration. When he was sentenced to death, he stood on the block before being hanged and spouted the words, Purimfest. Seems that he himself was calling back to his and Hitler's assertions that should they fail, it would be another celebration of Purim. Now, some interesting things have happened with this because a lot of people view this as a prophetic event, particularly in Esther 9, 12 and 13. There is this thing that happens where it says that the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and also the 10 sons of Haman, only in the next verse to have Esther call for the 10 sons of Haman to be hanged on the gallows. Why would she ask for dead men to be hanged? Now, that's a good question. Part of it may be as simple as saying, well, maybe she just wants their bodies hung for people to see as an example. Others have seen this as a prophetic statement. They think there's a little bit more to it than that, that the word tomorrow does not refer just to tomorrow, but that there is a much farther off tomorrow, and that that is one that she too is referring to. Now, what that has come down to is that in the rendering of the names of Haman's 10 sons, there are small letters. Those letters in particular are Tav, Shin, and Zayin. You'll see that in the pictures here that I brought up. There's also a very large Vav in the last one there. Each of those, if you are counting in the gematria and the tradition of using the Hebrew letters as numbers and drawing conclusions from the mathematical patterns that can be drawn within those letters, you'll see that Tav equals 400, Shin equals 300, and Zayin equals 7. Many have added that up to be 707. The large Vav in there, they say, indicates the 6, Vav being 6, the 6th letter in the Hebrew alphabet and corresponding to the number 6, that refers to the number of centuries that had passed since there was no, there 707 was 0707 and 1707 was the 2nd century and on and so on, that would make 5707 a marked date in the hanging of the 10 sons of Haman, presumably here. The date then of the hanging of Stryker and others was October 16th of 1946, which was the 21st of Tishri, 5707. That is also the 7th day of Sukkot, and was is a holy day in Jewish history, and interestingly enough was actually a date that was a postponement from what should have been in the previous April. Of course, you note that had that occurred in the previous April, it would not have been in the year 5707. Something to take note of. There were 11 men sentenced to death during the Nuremberg trials. Hermann Göring had committed suicide before his sentence was to be rendered, and so 10 men were hanged. Some consider this to be a prophecy that came from the lips of Esther herself. Now, because there was a triumph and God's people have been preserved, we do recognize God's provision and the joy of that. And while it's important to remember those lives lost and the precious people that need to be remembered, that we also remember the God that sees us through these hard times and that we can rejoice in Him. And so there are several traditions that surround that as well. And they say that feasting is so important on Purim that fasting for non-medical reasons is actually forbidden. You can't, even if you were in mourning, you should still come feast on Purim. That some of the traditional dishes include seeds and nuts, because this was supposedly the diet that Esther would have had to keep in order to keep kosher in the palace. It's traditional to eat Haman's pockets, or Haman's ears is the translation of the word Hamantaschen. These are little triangle pockets of pastries and sweet things. There's also a Talmudic custom that one should drink until they can no longer remember the difference between Haman and Mordecai. Now, While many people have many different opinions on intoxication, some say that this can also be fulfilled by drinking a little bit and falling asleep, wherein you also would not be conscious of the difference between the two. Now, it's another tradition to give gifts on Purim, and it's a big deal that you can give the mishloach manot, that are food gifts, and that you can give those out to others, and to celebrate that even the poor should have an opportunity to give to those who are poor, and that each individual should give to two people. There is an opportunity just to kind of pay it forward, if we can use that sort of terminology, right? To yet let this time of joy and gladness be shared with one another in our communities. There's also a very common tradition of masquerading, of dressing up on Purim. It's actually gone back to the 1500s. And now some say that this is the only time where it is acceptable for a man to dress up in women's garments, or for a woman to wear men's garments. Take that with what you will. That is a tradition versus what Torah says, so some people have different ideals on that. Let's be understanding of one another as we move forward, as we always should be, right? At the end of the day, the masquerading and dressing up in costume is really just a way for us to remember that Esther too had to hide who she was, and that we can even just take it as a friendly reminder that we don't have to hide, and that's a blessing, and so we feast. Now, how does Yeshua factor in? The fact of the matter is, it was debated whether Esther should be canonized at all, but there is a very interesting thing that happens here, because Haman is a product of Saul's disobedience to God. You can go all the way back to 1 Samuel 15:3-9, and you can see that there was a commandment to smite Amalek, utterly destroy them and not spare them, but that Saul spared Agag, and that Esther actually reaps the trouble from that action, considering that Haman was the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He is a descendant of the line Saul was supposed to wipe out and didn't. Mordecai, however, is actually a product of David's grace and God's blessing. That's really cool, because what you can see in 2 Samuel 16 is there's this guy who is shouting curses down as David's army is passing. This guy's name is Shimei. And even while one of the guards of David's army is like, you want me to kill him? David says, no, 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 no. Leave him alone, and let him curse me. The Lord hath bidden him. It may be that the Lord will look on mine affliction, and that the Lord will requite me good for his cursing this day. Well, good indeed, because Mordecai, the one who is the hero of the story, and who is Esther's cousin, and cares for her, and sends her in, and encourages her, he was a descendant of Shimei, this man that was spared by David's mercy and God's blessing of David's mercy on that day. So the fact of the matter is, without Esther, there would be no temple. Without Esther, there would be no line of David. And God uses these spectacular miracles years down the line with the fullness of eternity in mind. He uses these things to save his people and to fulfill his promises. And you too were specifically created for such a time as this.